like to introduce to you all Emily Adrid, who is new on CWCB's staff. She's our climate planning, water supply planning and climate adaptation lead, and she will be hosting our water availability task force meetings going forward. So we're happy to welcome Emily, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Kat. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Adrid, and I am the new Water Planning and Climate Impact Specialist here at CWCB. I've been here for about a month now, and yeah, I'll be taking over facilitating duties for the Water Availability Task Force meetings. It's nice to meet everybody, and I think if our presenters are ready, we can start. So our first presentation is from the state climatologist. I'm just gonna keep letting people in here. And I think we just gave you Peter co-hosting permissions. So I think feel free to share your screen.
Great, will do. Alrighty, are you seeing my slides in full screen mode?
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks and good morning, everyone. Emily, it's very nice to meet you. Welcome aboard. For those who may not know me, my name is Peter and I am part of the team at the State Climate Office at Colorado State University. I was introduced as the state climatologist. I am not the state climatologist, but I did stay in a Holiday Inn Express last night. So here we go with the slides. Going to be a pretty standard update here. For those who are regulars on the call, we're going to start with some current conditions, looking at mostly temperature and precipitation statistics from recent months and how those compare to other years of record. We'll take a look at the current drought monitor from the US Drought Monitor map and talk about that update a little bit, as well as how things have changed in recent weeks. They definitely have changed, as you would guess from how wet June was. And then we'll look at where we may be going from here. And when I wrap up, we'll transition over to the Natural Resources Conservation Service. We'll give more of an update on water supply conditions, which tends to dovetail really nicely with this presentation. So we'll start with those current conditions. We're looking at precipitation and temperature first and foremost, and then some additional statistics on some other variables. This is a really nice picture from Henry Regis in our office from the storm in the metro area as it migrated east across the plains just last Friday. That one was a really beautiful storm and captured it nicely here. All right, so starting with June, not a surprise to probably anyone on the call that June was a much wetter than normal month in 2023. So I'm going to show a number of maps that look a lot like this. These are gridded precipitation and temperature ranking maps from the National Centers for Environmental Information NCLIME Grid product. It uses station data going back all the way to 1895, as well as some other products to help fill in the gaps and known physical relationships between climate variables and elevation to make these beautiful spatially complete maps. Just because they are fully spatially complete doesn't mean we actually have observations at every single grid point, and it doesn't mean that these maps are entirely the same as ground truth. So just important to keep that in mind as we go along here. But we can see that for Eastern Colorado, out of this 129-year period of record that we are looking at, for much of the eastern portion of the state, this was a top 10 wettest June in the record. And in fact, there's quite a large area in Eastern Colorado, just immediately east and southeast of the metro area, even touching the metro area, that had its wettest June on record out of all 129 Junes in the record. And there are even some areas in this gridded product, like southern Elbert County, where this was the wettest month ever recorded. So the statewide average was 1.29 inches above average. When you're averaging over such a large area, that number tends to get smaller than you might expect, doesn't really do it justice. In some areas where we saw a record wet month, this was well over 5 inches above average. And in fact, if we look at May and June combined, a lot of these areas just east of the metro area had near or above their annual average rainfall in just the months of May and June. So again, just putting these recent anomalies in context. And of course, again, a large portion of eastern Colorado ranks in the top 10 wettest May through Junes on record, as May was also a wet month. We can see here some dry anomalies creeping in on the west slopes if we integrate May and June here. These months were a little bit below normal despite the wet conditions east of the Continental Divide, not nearly as much moisture as you might expect spilling over to the other side of the divide. Or in fact, you may expect that, because oftentimes when one side of the Continental Divide is wet, the other side of the Continental Divide ends up being dry. If we zoom out to the water year to date, which is now the first three, or the water year through June, to date would include a few more weeks, but this is the first 3 quarters of our water year. And now we can see wet anomalies creeping in on the west slopes. And this is largely due to the much above average snow season that we had in our westernmost mountains in the state. And it's largely an extension of the good snow season that we saw all across California, Utah, a lot of that soaked into Colorado as well. And then if we look on the Eastern Plains here, that's mostly what happened in the last 2 months, May and June. And so this script really couldn't have played out much nicer from a water availability standpoint for us, in that the west slopes was wet when really it needed to be wet in the cold season when we build up snowpack. And then the Eastern Plains were wet when they needed to be wet, late in the spring and early in the summer, when things tend to be at their wettest climatologically. We really bullseyed that wet season as well. One interesting thing that I'll talk more about in coming slides is some of this area in the middle of the state, Summit County, Lake County, down into some areas around the Sangre de Cristos and San Luis Valley, didn't really get the best of either extreme. You might expect that those areas in the middle would get the best of both worlds, but they got the best of neither world, where conditions have been more towards a normal year, with in fact some areas being a little bit drier than normal in the center of our state. All right, this is a look at the precipitation percentiles for the last 30 days. So not quite all the way up to today's date, just the 23rd of June through the 22nd of July. And we can see that there's definitely short-term dryness creeping back in on the west slopes, particularly southwestern Colorado. We'll take a little bit more of a look at that in coming slides and some of the impacts that we might be experiencing from the short-term dryness coming back in here. But then we also see on the Eastern Plains that in some areas, the wetter than normal conditions have continued. I should note that this percentile ranking is with respect to a shorter period of record than the products that we have been looking at with the last couple maps. This comes from the Climate Mapper tool from Climate Toolbox. So it's just set up a little bit differently. I apologize for the varying frames of reference here, but I'll try to keep you as informed of any varying periods of record as we go through these slides, so you can help put this in the best context possible. Now, if we look at precipitation from a standardized precipitation index standpoint, for those who may not be familiar with the standardized precipitation index, It's basically a way of looking at the rarity of a given precipitation event, or how rare is it for it to be that wet, or how rare is it for it to be that dry. If you're interested in the nitty gritty, what we're doing here is we're integrating a certain accumulation window, in this case, the 17th of June through the 16th of July, and looking at for each year in the period of record, how does this 17th of June through 16th of July compare to other years? We're fitting that to a gamma distribution, and then looking at if that distribution were normal, which with precipitation, it's not always, how many standard deviations above or below normal would it be? Now, what you really need to know only is that the warm colors are where it's been drier than normal. These reds and dark reds are where it's much drier than normal. And then the cool colors are where it's wetter than normal. And the purples are where it's kind of a rare wet event. So seeing a lot of what we saw in the other 30-day image here, but we'll back out to 90 to make it a little bit more interesting. And I'll show a couple other timescales as well. If we go out to 90 days, this brings us back to the middle of April. And we can see that, again, even on the 90-day timescale, the west slopes have been dry in recent months, particularly Mesa County around Grand Junction, some dry SPIs scattered throughout the San Juans and just south of there, as well as up towards Routt County around the Steamboat and Hayden area. But then for eastern Colorado, as you would expect, a lot of very wet SPIs from our station data. If we back out to 6 months, most of the dry conditions disappear in western Colorado, but some of this area around Summit and Lake County is showing up a little drier than normal. And that's what I was talking about, where they didn't actually have a particularly good snow season in that area. It was more average to even slightly a little bit below average, and then didn't have a particularly wet late spring, early summer like we did east of the Continental Divide. And then if we look at the last 12 months, we see that most of the dry side SPIs disappear at this time scale, and we're left with just a pretty good picture over the last 12 months with a wetter than normal 12-month period. And typically in Colorado being a semi-arid state where water availability is a concern, to some degree, we do celebrate this, although we know that there are certainly impacts to the wet conditions as well, as Kevin Houck can attest to. All right, so now we're going to shift gears just a little bit and look at some temperature statistics. This is very similar, or the same format really, to the precipitation statistics that I showed first off. So here we are looking at the month of June and how it ranks to compared to the other 129 years in record in this product in terms of temperature. And we can see that June was cooler than normal across much of the state and ranked kind of in the middle of the long-term historical distribution in other areas. Statewide and average anomaly with respect to, again, this is what I was talking about with some of the different periods of reference, 1.2 Fahrenheit below the 20th century average. Now, this is much cooler than what you might think just based on the map alone, given that we do have a significant warming trend over this time. And more often than not, especially since the turn of the millennium, these maps tend to be warmer than the 20th century average. So if we were to just look at how things compare to what I would argue is the more relevant 1991 through 2020 temperature normals, or what have we looked like lately, things were even more cool with respect to those normals. I believe you'd be looking at more like a 3 to 4 degree negative anomaly for the month of June. Another thing that I like to point out here for the month of June is that the maximum daily temperatures, those anomalies were more significant than the minimum daily temperatures or our nighttime temperatures. Otherwise put, the nighttime temperatures were much closer to normal. The daily maxes were quite a bit cooler than normal in June. You know, with all the storm activity, I apologize for my dog there. with the storm activity that we experienced in June when that hot early summer sun was beating down on the land surface, with all the moisture we had in the air, instead of continuing to heat the land surface, that summer sun went into generating thunderstorms. And so that kept some of our afternoon temperatures down. All right, so now we are looking at, I believe, the first 3 quarters of the water year. Again, so this is looking at October through June with temperature rankings, and we can see, like the month of June, we're looking at mostly cooler than average with our full historical ranking, or in kind of in the middle. But again, with the warming trend that we've seen in more years than not recently, particularly for a full 9 months of the water year, you would expect that it would likely be 35th warmest or higher. So this is actually the coolest first 3 quarters of a water year that we've had since 1993. And we have not a full water year cooler than the 20th century average since the start of the 21st century. So a couple of years that were close, I think 2009 and 2019 were pretty close, but as far as cool anomalies go in this millennium, or the last 23 years, this is among the coolest. Will it stay below the 20th century average? We'll see. I'm kind of guessing that we might creep above that mark just over the last 3 months. Certainly working on it now with some of the hot conditions that we've experienced just in the last week or so here. All right, this is a picture that kind of puts the temperature and precipitation statistics together. This is on the x-axis. We're looking at, for the first 9 months of the water year, the accumulated average precipitation across the state of Colorado. And on the y-axis, we're looking at the average temperature over the first 9 months of the water year. The stitched lines meet where the 1991 through 2020 normal is. So if you're to the left of that, you're drier than normal, right of that, wetter than normal. Below where the stitch lines meet, you're cooler than normal. Above that, you are warmer than normal. And you can see 2023 for the first 9 months of the water year, squarely in the cool and wet quadrant of this quadrant chart. The last comparable year, you can see 2019 close by, just a little bit warmer and a little bit wetter statewide than 2023, versus where we've been hanging out a lot recently. You can see 2018, 2020, and 2022 all within that warm and dry quadrant. So nice to get some reprieve from some of these long-term drought conditions that we have been experiencing in recent years. Here's how we've looked over the last 30 days. Again, not quite through the 25th where we are today, but you can see some warm anomalies over southwest Colorado, but cooler than normal continuing in eastern Colorado. Of course, the warm anomalies are starting to stack up now. So with the last week or week and a half, we definitely have been above normal again. We started July cooler than normal, kind of continuing that June trend, but things have kind of flipped on us, and it looks like there are more 90-degree days in the forecast. So some of these cooler areas may regress to the mean looking at the rest of the month of July. All right, this is a look at the Evaporative Demand Drought Index, or EDDI, for 1 and 3 month timescales. We look at this because the effective thirst of the atmosphere for water vapor, or how quickly that the water in our soils and in our lake streams and reservoirs gets pulled out through evaporation and transpiration, depends not just on temperature, but also on surface humidity, cloud cover, and wind speeds. And I'll start by looking at the 3-month Evaporative Demand Drought Index, or EDDI, where you can see, unsurprisingly, these blue colors represent lower than normal evaporative demand, with the cooler, humid conditions that we've experienced. This makes sense that evaporative demand would be lower, You'll likely hear more about this from some water providers later, that I know that demand was certainly lower than normal in the month of June. And then if we look at the west slopes, we actually see higher than normal demand, with some temperature anomalies that were a little bit closer to average and some drier conditions. Over the last month, though, according to the Evaporative Demand Drought Index, we're seeing some very high evaporative demand out on the west slopes. This is definitely worth keeping an eye on. We have had warmer conditions, as I showed, in southwest Colorado recently. Kind of surprised, if I'm being honest with you, that it creeps up this far to the north. And I'm not sure that I have a great explanation for that just offhand. I think that's worth investigating further. Sometimes when I see a bit of a discrepancy between, say, evaporative demand drought index and temperature, I can explain it with maybe conditions have been particularly windy, or maybe dew points have been particularly low, but I'm not coming up with anything off the top of my head that necessarily squares this with what we saw temperature-wise over the last month. So maybe I'll investigate a little there during the NRCS presentation and see what I can come up with. This is looking at the water supply and demand picture. If you kind of put together precipitation and that evaporative demand or potential ET component, this is looking at growing season water balance from our Colorado Agricultural Meteorological Network, or COAGMET, weather stations with at least 15 years of record with good data. And it's looking at a percentile ranking of that water supply or precipitation over water demand or potential ET. And you can see, unsurprisingly, with the high precipitation anomalies and some of those evaporative demand anomalies, that we have high percentiles here, where conditions have been wetter than normal on the eastern side of the Continental Divide, and even in places like the San Luis Valley. Now, the west slopes, I will say that we're underrepresented here very clearly, especially in northwest Colorado. But this Olathe station is showing since the beginning of the growing season, which for the purposes of these graphics is considered to be April 1st, that we're only at the 5th percentile. I believe that that's the second lowest year on record for the growing season to date, or April 1st through July 21st. So definitely, even though we had a good snow season out west, drier conditions recently. From a soil moisture standpoint, this is looking at, for the middle of the month, how is our soil moisture looking in the top 10 centimeters and the top meter. I apologize, these graphics do not show the wet side of the percentile rankings. If you're in the gray, that's just the 31st percentile or higher. I can pull up maps later that show the entire percentile range, and you'll see that particularly for the top meter, where there's a little bit more memory in the soil, we still have some wet soils, particularly in northeast Colorado. Top 10 centimeters, though, we're looking at dry soils across much of western Colorado. And when things go dry, this is kind of the first indicator to turn, because this is just the first top 10 centimeters or 4 inches closest to the ground. You have a fairly short memory there. So this tends to correlate fairly closely with, say, 30-day SPIs, or sometimes even a shorter window, like 15-day accumulations. And so it's not surprising to see that soil moisture, at least closest to the surface, has turned in western Colorado with the drier conditions recently. If you look at the top meter, though, this is where things start to get a little bit more concerning, that across fairly large chunks of western Colorado, we are now seeing drier than normal soil moisture start to creep into the picture. This is a look at the Vegetation Drought Response Index, or VEGDRI, which is looking at satellite-derived measurements of vegetative health. It's essentially using an index called NDVI, or Normalized Vegetation Index, to derive this, which is basically looking at, from these satellite readings, how well is the vegetation absorbing near-infrared radiation, which is a part of the photosynthesis process. versus a normal year. And we can see where we would expect vegetative health to be good. In eastern Colorado, it certainly is. This, I think, goes really well with the anecdotal evidence that I've gathered that things have been quite green this year. Even now, more greenness sticking around than we would maybe see in a normal year. And then you can see some of the areas that we had longer term wetness on the west slopes also still showing some strong vegetative health conditions. However, if we look at some of those areas in the middle that I alluded to earlier, San Luis Valley, as well as up into some of our high country, Summit County, Lake County, Eastern Eagle County. These are areas where we're starting to see some pre-drought stress or moderate drought, according to satellite readings. So certainly something to keep in mind going forward. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about where we stand with the US Drought Monitor and how things have changed over recent months. This is a look at the current Drought Monitor map. There will be a new one in just a couple days here, but just recently added this short-term abnormally dry across much of southwest Colorado with some of the drier conditions that we've seen just in recent months. That doesn't mean that the water supply is bad. Some of the reservoirs in this area really recovered with the nice snow year, but we have seen above normal temperatures recently and below normal precipitation over about the last 3 months. And that's starting to creep into some of our surface hydrology indicators like soil moisture, like vegetative health. So now starting to show on the US Drought Monitor. The east side of the Continental Divide looking good, not showing any drought, which is a big difference from 3 months ago. I also want to mention the San Juans not shown in drought here. That's not because they've been wet recently. It's because in the mountainous regions of southwest Colorado, what happens in the winter is especially important, and the San Juans had a good winter. And in fact, I was just up in the high country of the San Juans a week and a half ago and observed that there's still quite a bit of snow hanging out at above 12,000 feet, much more than you would expect normally at this time of year, kind of holdover from our good snow season. This is how things have changed over the last 12 weeks or about 3 months. And you can see that, you know, with the recent dry conditions, we've had a 1-class degradation from no drought 12 weeks ago on the west slopes to showing some abnormally dry now. And then in eastern Colorado, 12 weeks ago, we were worried going into the spring. Things had been quite dry through the fall and winter, and the spring started off slow. So we were definitely worried going into the spring season, but then the rains did indeed show up. And in fact, I wanted to point out one area in the far southeast corner of the state where we had the maximum 5-class improvement. 12 weeks ago, this area was in D4 drought, or second percentile or worse drought conditions, and has moved all the way back up to no drought over just a 12-week period. This is a precipitation accumulation graphic from Campo in that area of the state, far southeast Colorado, showing the stippled line here is our average accumulation throughout the water year. The black line shows what we've seen in water year 2023. The green stippled line shows what would be normal from here. And then the blue and red shows an above and below normal projection. The gray lines show if you stacked the remainder of any given historical water year onto this one, what it would look like. But the part that I really wanted to emphasize was take a look at where we were in late April. We were at less than, I think we were at less than 25% of normal as late as the 4th week of April this year. And we went from that all the way to well above normal in the middle of July. So a really remarkable recovery there from well below normal to above normal. So that's where we're at currently. I'm going to go ahead and transition into where things are headed. we'll take a look at the outlook, starting with just the 7-day weather forecast and then an 8 to 14-day outlook. Then we'll look at some longer seasonal outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. I tried to find all the La Niñas in my previous slideshow from last year and change them to El Niños. This one slipped by me, but we'll talk about El Nino because we have transitioned quite rapidly from a La Nina to an El Nino, which is expected to stick around for the foreseeable future. So just a look from our weather models at what we expect precipitation-wise over the next 7 days. This is looking at, well, this is really from yesterday morning through the end of the month. The areas in brown are where we are expecting below normal precipitation. The areas in green or blue-green are where we expect above. And you can see most of the region, it's looking like a dry week. It's looking like another warmer than normal week. Although starting this weekend, in some of the areas that in fact have been a little bit drier, we are expecting some precipitation activity. And in fact, some of the thunderstorms that we see in the South Central Rockies moving up into the high country in central Colorado this weekend, we could see some storms that have some pretty strong accumulation rates, but they will be scattered in nature. If you were to look at the 7-day accumulation starting this morning through August 1st, you would start to see this change as around the middle of next week, we're looking at things moistening up across the state, particularly eastern Colorado, again, where it looks like we could get a good shot of above normal moisture following the passage of a cool front early to mid next week, where we could see some above average dew points kind of advected into the region from the central plains, where things tend to be a little bit moister and stickier this time of year. And some of that could result into some thunderstorm activity middle of next week. So certainly something to keep an eye on out there. I know Kevin's kind of always on edge this time of year because it tends to be kind of peak monsoon season. You can have the flash flooding events in southern Colorado. You can have them up in metro area. You can have them in eastern Colorado. So certainly an interesting time of year from a flash flood standpoint. But the next 6 days really looking fairly safe with some exceptions in south central and central Colorado. 8 to 14-day outlook, getting into that time frame I talked about, where we could have some above normal moisture filtering into the region. The Climate Prediction Center is giving us a slight tilt towards probabilities of above normal moisture over that first week of August. Like I said, a lot of this moisture actually originates more from the central plains than it does from the Gulf of Mexico or Eastern Pacific. So you might see a little bit of more your typical monsoonal moisture activity this weekend with what's going on in southern and central Colorado. But what's going on later next week doesn't necessarily look like that textbook monsoon pattern that we tend to see this time of year. And then there's a slight tilt towards above normal temperature conditions continuing across the state next week. With what I've seen in the weather models since putting these slides together yesterday, maybe in eastern Colorado, you could kind of tilt that more towards near normal. You know, it doesn't necessarily look like heat wave conditions throughout that whole week or anything like that. But maybe for western Colorado, you could keep that tilt towards above normal temperature. We'll see how it plays out. Once you go past that 8 to 14-day time frame and you look at more monthly and seasonal outlooks, our weather prediction models tend to descend into chaos, and you have to look at more slow-moving land surface and ocean surface predictors of weather, things that have statistically somewhat reliable relationships between what happens over the oceans and what happens in our weather. Speaking most prominently about the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO. So once we get into fall in particular, El Nino does tend to have some semi-predictable influence on what happens over Colorado. But this is just looking at the month of August. And I think the biggest thing here is that some of our models are expecting the below normal monsoon season that has started to kind of continue into the month of August. So you're seeing an increased tilt towards below normal precipitation there. And then for August 2023, you're seeing an increased tilt towards above normal temperature, particularly down in southwest Colorado. When it comes to these monthly temperature outlooks, a lot of this is really still based on trend. I talked about earlier how conditions are getting warmer over time, even though that this year in particular has been on the cooler side of the recent 91 through 2020 normal. A lot of the climate prediction center skill when it comes to longer term temperature outlooks comes from all else equal bet on warmer than normal, just since that's the way things are trending with higher greenhouse gas concentrations. But I think once you get into southwest Colorado, if indeed the below normal moisture from the monsoon continues, that's likely to be coupled with warmer, drier conditions. So the western end of the state, I think like it's shown here, you can put a little bit more stake in likely to see a continuation of these above normal temperature conditions, whereas on the east side of the Continental Divide, things are looking much less certain there. Now, once we go into August through October, we see a fairly similar map in both temperature and precipitation to what we saw in August. However, I do want to bring up the impacts that El Nino typically has on our state as we get into fall, particularly into September, October, November. This map just shows the probability of holding on to El Nino conditions in the equatorial Pacific throughout the coming month. So right now we're in El Nino, and we're likely to see that continue throughout the fall, greater than 90 or even greater than 95% that this continues through at least midwinter. And that does have some semi-predictable effects on Colorado once we get into the fall, particularly once we get into September, October, not so much August, which is, still summer season. But we do see across a lot of the state that when we have El Nino during fall, there's an increased probability of a cool extreme and an increased probability of a wet extreme for most of the state. The San Luis Valley Climate Division isn't included in either of those, but the rest of the state, we tend to see a greater probability of cool and wet in fall during El Nino. I like to use the analogy of a game of cards here, where it's kind of like playing a hand of poker with a few extra aces in the deck, at least when it comes to moisture. You have a better probability of a good hand, but it can still very much go either way. So can't guarantee a wet fall, but when it comes to having El Nino, it does raise the probability. And that's shown in this correlation analysis here, where we're looking at by season using data from 1951 through 2020. Are you more likely to have wet conditions during La Nina or El Nino? Areas in blue shaded in blue are more likely to be wet during La Nina. Areas shaded in red are more likely to be wet during El Nino. And this is showing the winter season in the upper right or upper left, spring upper right, summer lower left, and fall lower right. And we can see for fall, most, if not all of the state shows up in red. And much of this actually is statistically significant. Like I said, that doesn't guarantee a wet fall, but it does increase the probability of a wet fall. And that's why I've kind of drawn in my own little up arrow here for at least eastern Colorado for August, September, October. I didn't put it in Western Colorado because what we're seeing in some of these models with the monsoon, if we do verify below normal for the monsoon, it's likely that, some of these areas in Southwest Colorado could see below normal August through October precipitation. But I think the equal chances forecast from the Climate Prediction Center, given the strength of this El Nino and the likelihood we hold on to it, we could probably go with a little bit of an increase tilt towards above normal in some other parts of the state where things tend to be a little bit less driven by the monsoon. All right, so that's what I have for the outlook. Just a few key takeaways here. June was much wetter than normal for Eastern Colorado, and that's on top of an already good snow season in Western Colorado, which puts us in a better position than we've been in at least since 2019 from a water supply perspective. But we do see some dry conditions creeping back in Western Colorado that are already starting to affect some of our surface hydrology, like soil moisture and like vegetative health. And we've had a below average start to the monsoon season that's expected to continue. However, with El Nino conditions in place, that raises our likelihood of wet conditions across much of the state once we get into September or October. One other point that I want to bring up before I leave you here is that we are hosting a climate services summit at the CSU Spur Hydro Building on August 8th and 9th, and registration is open with the link below. If you want to learn more about what the Climate Center does and how the Climate Center may be able to help you with what you do, I would highly recommend registering. It is a hybrid meeting. You can register either virtually or in person, I believe, but we would love to see you all there. So I will wrap up with that. And if there's any questions or comments, I can certainly take those at this time.
Thanks so much, Peter. Also a plug, I will be on a panel at the Climate Services Summit, so hopefully I'll see some of you there.
Awesome.
But if anybody has questions for Peter or comments, feel free to ask away. All right, well, hearing none, I think we can move on to our next presentation from NRCS. So I believe it will be Carl presenting. And I think that I think you have sharing permissions. So whenever you're ready.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Get this shared real quick. Come on, there it goes. All right, can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, well, thank you as always, Peter, for kind of getting the ball rolling on things. This time of year from the NRCS perspective, it's a bit more of a brief presentation as we are past the snow melt season and pretty much all the way through our primary water supply forecast season. Most of our forecasts are for the April through July period, which we are just about to the end of. Some basins we do have forecasts going all the way through September, but at this point, I'm mostly going to just touch base on some of our observed stream flow statistics. Mountain precipitation as well as reservoir storage is going to be kind of the prime focuses today, but I will go ahead and just dive into what's been happening up in Northwest Colorado. In the combined Yampa White and Little Snake basins, currently at 115% of the median water year-to-date precipitation. You can see throughout the vast majority of the water year, been holding it well above normal precipitation levels. until we kind of really been drying out for the last month or so, which will certainly be a strong trend, as Peter noted, across much of the state, but particularly across essentially all of southern and western Colorado. We'll make one just quick note. Some of these precipitation products do have some little blips in them currently, that we have yet to go back and kind of fix the data for those. As we dive into our summer maintenance season, sometimes we will have those inconsistencies that we have to go back and clean up the database a little bit. So apologies for some weird looking precipitation data, but really should still paint the picture pretty well across most major basins. I'm sorry, minimizing something real quick here. Looking at reservoir storage, naturally not too much for reservoir storage up in the Yampa, but it is looking pretty dang good, with Yamcolo at slightly below median values, Stagecoach a little bit above the median values. And also, most of you folks have probably heard this before. I'll kind of use the terms median and the more general term normal. We've recently switched to our preferred central tendency for what we call the normal values, the 30-year normal, which is currently 1991 to 2020. So you may hear me switch back and forth between median and normal, but I'll be referring to essentially the same thing. But going into our time series of total basin reservoir storage here, you can see we've had some pretty dramatic increases in those couple reservoirs over the last few months. Slight drop last month, but getting us back into some of the highest values we've seen since 2020, which is encouraging there. So again, for stream flow, this month I decided to take more of a look at what was observed, since we're essentially at the end of our primary forecast period in most basins. So what most of these maps are going to be looking at is the percentile of observed stream flow from April 1st through June 30th. And then coming up next month, we will have kind of the final data collected for that full April through July period, which naturally kind of represents the primary snowmelt runoff season. Another thing to note, these particular maps are displaying the percentile relative to the entire period of record. So not just that 30-year normals period, which we commonly reference. So a lot of these can range anywhere from, I'd say very commonly at least 50 years, some to well over 100 years. So definitely some pretty striking numbers we really saw across much of Western Colorado. You can see Yampa at Maybell, as well as the White near Meeker there, both in the 94th percentile. Really, really impressive stream flow volumes coming out of these basins so far this year. Moving down into the Colorado River Basin, currently at 105% of the median water year-to-date precipitation. Again, we'll see this kind of over and over again, but essentially pretty much flatlined for the last month across the Colorado headwaters. So not even necessarily kind of far southwestern Colorado this year where we've been seeing this, but really just rather some isolated exceptions up in northern Colorado that really have been receiving that mountain precipitation over the last month or so. As Peter touched on as well, some of the good news of this recent dryness is reservoir storage across the state has shown really impressive improvements and is really sitting pretty dang good with quite a few reservoirs above normal, or the majority of reservoirs in the state actually holding above normal values, which is certainly true in the Colorado currently. Going to our longer term time series here. Again, you can see just a small net volumetric drop over the last month, but that's following steady increases in this basin since looks like kind of late 2021 with a small blip last year, but certainly total basin-wide storage looking pretty strong, well above the normal total volumetric storage, and in range of what we saw in 2019, and then back a few more years beyond that. So definitely sitting in a good situation storage-wise as we exit the primary snowmelt runoff season. So just a snapshot of some of those April through June observed stream flows. You will notice here, and I'll have a comment on the South Platte coming up next. Sometimes we don't have all of our adjustments available in real time, or sometimes it can even take several months for cooperators to get adjustments for our naturalized stream flows. So if you happen to see in any of these maps blank spots, that's probably the case. And we are still just trying to collect that data on reservoir storage changes, diversions, tunnels, things like that. But some of the ones we do have, certainly one to take note of, up on Willow Creek, we saw that was, this basin encompasses a good chunk of the burn scar from the East Troublesome fire, which we saw really dramatic and impressive runoffs through the month of April, still sitting considerably higher for the 3-month period than anything else in the area. But certainly just nothing else is scientifically interesting one to follow. Just really seeing how all of that snow just flashed out of there throughout the month of April. Roaring Fork at Glenwood had 70, it was in the 76th percentile. Williams Fork 74th, just a little snapshot of what was going on. Some of these are certainly more interesting, kind of in other parts further west in Colorado, where we really saw the impressive numbers. Water year-to-date precipitation in the South Platte is currently right at 100% of that normal value. You can see that there have been kind of more steady increases over the last month to month and a half that we haven't seen so much on the western slope. Definitely been one of the more dry parts of the state overall throughout the water year, but still sitting near normal is not a bad position to be in compared to some of the things we've observed in past years. Kind of a snapshot of some major reservoirs. Definitely storage is looking pretty strong. You can really see that there's only a couple here that are sitting much below their median value for July 1st. And those are still probably in the 85 to 90% of median. The majority of them sitting at well above normal reservoir storage values. And taking a look at our time series here, getting back into the range of some of the higher values we've seen going back, 10 years or so, going back, here's 2013, 2014. So definitely sitting well above normal total basin storage, with even continued increase from from June 1st to July 1st here. And again, here in the next week or so, we'll be starting to get the data in for the next monthly values. And this, I did not include, as you can see, the observed stream flow. A lot of the stream flow points on the northern Front Range do take a while for folks to calculate a lot of the diversion data to get those naturalized flows. So I did just opt out of presenting those because there was really only 1 or 2 points we do have those calculations for right now. But heading back to the western slope in the Gunnison Basin, currently at 127% of median water year-to-date precipitation. You can see here kind of late March almost hit record territory and then kept going up steadily until, again, this last month or so, call it more or less flatlined with really minimal mountain precipitation. So we will see how things start to change if we start to get some monsoonal moisture or anything. But it has been an interesting year because commonly up at those higher elevations, we would still see some degree of spotty thunderstorm activity, some stations picking up a little here or there, but really across western Colorado and southern Colorado, it has been just extremely dry for the last month. Reservoir storage is definitely very good news across the Gunnison. The Gunnison, as well as our combined Southwest basins, had been holding on to by far the biggest deficits in the state over the last 3 years or so. So the substantial snowpacks in these areas have really been welcome, with this significant stream flow volumes boosting reservoir storage. You can see here, Blue Mesa, biggest reservoir in the state, has popped back up above the 100% of normal line. But really the vast majority of these are very, very near to above normal, which is a considerable difference over this time last year. So great to see as we look forward in the Gunnison. Here you can really take a look at the time series to see how dramatic that increase has been, going from last fall. I believe it was, I know for Blue Mesa last November was the lowest it had been since it very first filled way back in the day, but basin wide, we're still looking at some really, really low values compared to about a 30-year period of record here. So huge increases. You can certainly see the biggest one was throughout the month of May and into June there, but really, really encouraging to see that storage kick up going into an uncertain future. So back to our April through June observed stream flow values. Certainly some pretty impressive numbers here. And again, I'll remind you that many of these are going back over 100-year periods of record. So really some of the most notable ones would be kind of throughout the North Fork of the Gunnison here, with Surface Creek in the 100th percentile, representing the highest volume on record ever recorded coming down there. Way up there on Paonia Reservoir inflow, North Fork Gunnison kind of right below it, Slate near Crested Butte. But even all the way down Gunnison near Grand Junction, which I'm sure has a very long period of record, a very major pour point there, being at the 90th percentile, really does represent a pretty substantial volume of water. So going down into our combined Southwest basins of the San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juan, pretty similar patterns to what was observed really throughout the entire water year, as we just saw in the Gunnison. Currently at 123% of the median. Similarly, you can see here in late March, we did actually peak up into record territory a little bit, followed by fairly normal increases for another month and a half or so, and then essentially no considerable mountain precipitation has been received for at least the last 3 weeks, probably a little bit more. So definitely dry and definitely hot. I can certainly vouch for much of what Peter noted. I particularly took, well, several of the products, but it has been as hot and dry in Western Colorado as the data implies. Having been spending some time out here, it's been rather oppressive feeling. Definitely, I will anecdotally support what Peter's data was showing on that front. Again, back to some of the really good news, reservoir storage. You can see Navajo is still below normal. That's a very large reservoir. I don't know the capacity off the top of my head, but a lot of these more medium-sized reservoirs in those combined Southwest basins really all sitting at above normal values. At the end, when I get to the statewide wrap-up, you'll notice that these basins are the only in the state with a total volumetric deficit below normal currently. But bear in mind that is largely driven by Navajo. Much of that water is essentially heading out of the state at that point. But a lot of the other smaller reservoirs that Colorado water users are relying on have filled up to above normal values, which is great to see. Similar, very, very impressive increases as we saw in the Gunnison here over the last few months. See, over that last month, certainly not quite as much volume increase, but still a rather impressive bounce back. And again, bearing in mind, this deficit is largely going to be driven by the high volume Navajo reservoir, but that a lot of our higher up ones are sitting quite well currently. So going into our April through June observed stream flows, really, really impressive numbers kind of throughout this basin. I'm up north, San Miguel at Placerville is in the 76th percentile. Really big standout this year was the Dolores, sitting at both above and below McPhee at 9 in the 97th percentile. Really, really phenomenal volumes. We saw this both kind of in the Southwest San Juans. We saw it also pretty considerably in the Yampa, with really above average or above normal, excuse me, lower elevation snow. As noted by our lower elevation SNOTEL sites, but also just kind of anecdotally, that low elevation snow really drove a ton of early season high volume flows, both in the Dolores and the Yampa, really helping to boost those numbers, also causing a bit of flooding in those areas. It was welcome news for the rafting community, but certainly from a water supply standpoint, awesome to see this shift after the last 3 years being so dry, excuse me. Moving back east a little bit into the upper Rio Grande. Excuse me again, this data hiccup I'm sure is related to our SNOTEL maintenance, so we will get that cleaned up as soon as possible, but essentially pretty near normal water year-to-date precipitation in the Rio Grande. Can see pretty similar pattern to what's been observed in other parts of western and southern Colorado, with really just being pretty much bone dry for about the last month or so. Reservoir storage sitting pretty dang good. Sometimes these charts the scales can be kind of difficult to interpret given different volumes and different normals of various reservoirs, but basin-wide, volumetrically, you can see not only it had been above normal for the last year or so, which wasn't the case in its kind of neighbors to the west and northwest, but then did also get a pretty significant increase in storage throughout this spring over the last few months. With respect to both what we observed for snowpack, naturally precipitation along with that, and our observed stream flows, the Rio Grande was in a fairly interesting situation with, and you will see this in the Arkansas as well, but really, really stark differences in that snowpack was received here in the eastern San Juans versus the Sangre de Cristos, which ended up being one of the drier parts of the state throughout this entire water year. So definitely well represented here with well above normal, all of these observed stream flows coming out of the San Juans ranking quite well on the percentile scale, whereas a lot of these coming out of the Sangres are quite low. So really, really stark difference as precipitation wasn't quite able to make it across the San Luis Valley there to boost some of those stream flows. Moving on over into the Arkansas, I will preface this with, again, the fact that there was a lot of similarity to the Rio Grande and in a sense to the South Platte, which also saw pretty stark north to south differences in snowpack and precipitation. But all of these streams, again, emanating from the Sangre de Cristos, in this case flowing east, really got a relatively meager snowpack this year. So the observed stream flow in a lot of these southern tributaries quite a bit lower than we saw on the main stem. So I wanted to put that plug out there that anytime we're looking at some of these basin-wide products, it might not be representative of what's going on in your local area. So we certainly have quite a few new products to dig into sub-basin data and things like that. So I encourage you to do so. But currently, water year-to-date precipitation average across the entire basin is at 92% of normal. Again, same story as much of southern and western Colorado, really essentially flatlined on the precipitation front over the last month or so. So we will see what comes to be as we near what is commonly our primary monsoon precipitation season. Reservoir storage, certainly looking quite good. Just at a glance, only a couple here being slightly below normal. Most of them, again, all of these bar graph products aren't necessarily every reservoir in the basin, but a bit of a snapshot for you. Going to our time series here, similar to what we've seen in a lot of the state, we had that big snowpack year in 2019, which really helped boost things up. And then didn't drop as low as, say, the Gunnison and our combined Southwest basins, but had been consistently notably below normal on the reservoir storage side of things for the last 3 years. And then just over the last couple months, really shooting back up quite a bit, which is quite encouraging to see. Again here, apologies, we don't have all of our calculations available for the main stem here. But I'd imagine this Arkansas and Salida and Pueblo reservoir inflow are probably going to be more in the range of what was observed at Chalk Creek. They're in the 83rd percentile compared to the period of record. But again, sometimes it just takes a while to get all these observations and on diversion data and stuff. I think a lot of folks have data loggers out in the field or a variety of different means of collecting it. So, but just, I do have the one Trinidad lake inflow here in the 46th percentile, which, that's a near normal value, slightly below. So not terrible, but again, considerably different than what we were seeing coming out of the main stem headwaters here. And then naturally you can see Great Cliff kind of north to south in the middle, also lying in the middle of that range on a percentile basis, just kind of getting progressively drier as you move south in the Arkansas. So a quick roundup on some of our statewide conditions. Water year to date precipitation above normal in the vast majority of basins here, the exception of the Upper Rio Grande in Arkansas, but still not terrible, all above 90% of normal statewide here with the Gunnison combined Southwest basins and the Yampa, White, and Little Snake combined basins, certainly being the outliers on the high end, with our statewide percent of median precipitation at 108 there. And again, I'm sure everyone's well aware, I beat it to death, but never hurts to remind folks, particularly after Peter's presentation, that everything we're presenting is explicitly from mountain SNOTEL stations. So we are very explicitly looking at what's going on in the mountains within these basins, not necessarily including valley stations as well. So just always important to keep in mind when you're looking at some of these generalizations, exactly what data we're looking at, and particularly going forward into the monsoon season where we commonly observe relatively higher proportions of precipitation up in the mountains from those convective thunderstorm events. So, yep, here's our switch from the water year to date since October 1st, and here's our month to date. You can really see here single-digit percent of normals across really all of far southwest Colorado here. Not much better in the Arkansas, a little bit better in the Colorado headwaters, but as you can see, looking at our point data here, the the Colorado headwaters being a bit higher is largely just driven more by some of these main stem headwaters stations, where pretty much everything to the west has been, I'd confidently just call it bone dry for the last 3 weeks and possibly a bit more, but certainly encouraging some of our northern Colorado stations, not necessarily even just northern Front Range, but all the way over into some here in the flat tops and north of there, did at least receive some precipitation in the last 3 weeks, but starting to get some more would certainly be a welcome change for much of the rest of the state. Total statewide water year-to-date precipitation currently sitting at 108% of normal. Certainly an interesting statistic to have, but obviously from a water supply standpoint, always very important to really hone in on your local area, your local rivers, streams, reservoirs that are really impacting individuals directly. So here's just a quick time series of what we've seen with reservoir storage. Here is May 1st. Again, you can really see there was even significant increases from April 1st to May 1st. I believe in early April or certainly March, Gunnison and these combined Southwest basins were in the range of the mid to upper 60% of normal range, say 65 to 70% of normal. So they even saw a big increase there. Then you can see a really big jump to June 1st, not only down in those basins, but really statewide. And then on to July 1st, kind of leveled out. We certainly saw some more increases, but not as dramatic from June 1st through July 1st. And I feel like there's a number of things driving that. A lot of reservoirs we saw really, just making sure they were gonna fill throughout, say from April 1st through June 1st, and realistically across at least a lot of Western Colorado, and I think across much of the state, they were able to get those reservoirs pretty full by that time. So we saw a lot more releases, keeping the outflows up throughout the month of June up to July 1st. But in the big picture, really sitting in a pretty comfortable position statewide with respect to reservoir storage. Again, these combined Southwest basins, the only ones sitting below normal on a total volumetric basis, but that is largely driven by Navajo, whereas a lot of these other reservoirs are sitting well above normal. Going to our time series graph, we can really see this big increase. This bottom blue line is basically the summation of all our sub basins, and all of these lines are our major basins rather. But you can see this green and the yellow. Here's our Southwest basins. Here's the Gunnison. We're really driving a large proportion of that statewide deficit there, but really impressive increases back up to near and slightly above normal values statewide. So this is showing a comparison. Here we are looking at, you'll note most of what I've been referencing is percent of median, the percent of normal value. This chart is representing percent of total capacity. So the numbers will be a bit different, but I wanted to just put this in here because we're comparing current year 2023 to last year 2022, where we were sitting. Again, can really see how much recovery we've gotten. Here's the Gunnison. See that such a big increase there. Similarly in the combined Southwest basins, Upper Rio Grande, and here's our total statewide, just as a comparison, going from probably a little less than 70% of capacity statewide to probably in the range of 85 to 90% of capacity statewide reservoir storage. So here's a look at that 3-month observed stream flow, kind of switching metrics back to percent of the median as opposed to the percentile, which I was showing for individual stations. But still really significant stream flow volumes coming out of really all of Southwest Colorado. Again, the eastern half of the Rio Grande coming out of the Sangre de Cristos was a little bit more meager. South Platte certainly ended up on the low end. Again, missing data from quite a few points in the South Platte, but to be honest, I would anticipate those evening out. We've been observing some of the higher snowpacks and resulting stream flows in the northern Front Range, and then some of the lowest coming out of the main stem headwaters, kind of coming out of the South Park area. So I'd anticipate that will even out once the data is available, but regardless, South Platte kind of on the low end there, and then on the opposite side of the state, combined San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juan on the high end at a whopping 168% of normal volumetric stream flow. Yeah, just a quick summary here. So one would guess all SNOTEL sites have been melted out for a good number of weeks here. Still a bit of snow hanging out in the Alpine. I know in Western Colorado with the really hot, dry weather, what's up there has been going pretty quick. But water year-to-date precip has been near normal to well above normal, really statewide. But with the caveat of really extremely dry conditions across a good chunk of the mountainous regions of Colorado, really with the exception of far northern Colorado over the last month or so. Yeah, those April through June observed stream flow values, really quite impressive statewide as compared to what we have seen recently, but really particularly across all of Western Colorado. You notice some, like say the basin-wide number for the Colorado River Basin isn't quite as high as some other Western slope ones, but if you do isolate even the western half of that, as I noticed, some of the stuff coming off the Grand Mesa into the North Fork of the Gunnison and such, really, really impressive stream flow volumes across Western Colorado. Putting things back in context of that period of record percentile, about half of our stream flow forecast points in the state observed above the 75th percentile for volumetric stream flow in that April through June period. And again, strongly favoring Western Colorado there. And we've really seen great improvements to reservoir storage statewide, particularly in the basins that needed it the most, but really all basins across the board have seen some degree of notable increase in reservoir storage, which is certainly encouraging and great news as we move into our next year of uncertainty. But yeah, that is all I have for now. I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody has them.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask away. All right, hearing none, thanks again, Carl. I will now open it up to all the water providers on the call. It'd be great to hear from you all with your current conditions. So feel free to jump in with your name, affiliation, and updates on how things are going.
This is Swithin, Island Ranch Water and Sanitation. Well, Centennial Water and Sanitation. As Peter and Carl both alluded to, things in the South Platte, especially in the spring, have been very wet. That has kept demand down very low, and we're sitting pretty, no worries at all at this time with water supply.
Great, thanks, Swithin.
I can jump in. This is Jordan Soldano with Denver Water. It's kind of similar situation here. Right now, our reservoirs are at 97% full. So that's looking good. And then, yeah, our summer demands have been lower than normal as well with all the cool and wet weather.
Awesome. Thank you, Jordan.
Hi, this is Ethan Bravo with Colorado Springs Utilities. Similar situation here. We are at 92% of storage and lower demands.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in? All right. Well, hearing no other report outs. Just want to thank everyone for being on the call, especially to our presenters, Peter and Carl. I will just want to add that the next WATF meeting will be on Thursday, August 17th. So looking forward to working with you all in the future. And yeah, I'll see you all next month.